Greetings everyone, this is Jaqui. Welcome to today's session. It's the 106th session in the PowerVog Technical Webinar Series. And the topic we're going to cover today is VIOS, Top Tips for Successful Administration. I am so pleased to have Jaqui Lynch with us today to deliver this session. She has a huge amount of experience on this and some related topics, and is a regular presenter at the Technical University, the TechU, and also a lifetime power champion. But I'm sure Jaqui will introduce herself in her own way as I hand over to her. So without further ado, over to you, Jaqui.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that's the part that I hate, introducing myself. So I guess the short version is I'm originally from New Zealand. I've been working in IT for a very, very long time, always as a systems administrator or on the technical side. And I moved to the States in 1990, and pretty much since 1993 have been primarily working on AIX, including VIOS servers and all those kind of things. And for the last 6 years, I've been working as an independent consultant. So with that said, what I've done here is taken the presentations that I typically give at the PTechU and tried to consolidate them down into something that should be a little more than an hour. So we shall see. And what I tried to do was get you the top 10 tips. But as you'll see from the agenda, it's really more like 12 or so. And some of them are pretty basic things, and we'll go into them in a little bit more detail. But it's things like staying current. People don't understand, sometimes don't understand how critical that is. I'm looking at a client right now, and in order to upgrade their VIO server, I have to do a 3 to 4 step upgrade because they're so far back level. And that's a lot more risky and scary than if they just stayed current every 6 months. It would be basically like patching. So they become very complex and they take longer. I also deal with a lot of people that don't think they should do things like put on efixes and patch things like Java, SSH, and SSL. And I like to point out to them that there's a reason they're called hypers. It's because they're highly pervasive and they could take you down. And with Java, SSH, and SSL, if you don't patch them, hackers love it because that's how they can break in. So these are important things to do. We'll talk more about it.
Jaqui, I'm so sorry to interrupt. I've just been told that at least one person cannot hear anything. So I'm hearing you loud and clear. If there are people who are unable to hear, I will post some information about how you could dial in if necessary. Okay, most people can hear, it seems, so no problems. Just a quick interruption on in terms of if you have questions, please post them into the chat window. We'd appreciate that, and then I will either interrupt Jaqui at suitable times or we'll take them at the end of the session. On you go. Sorry, Jaqui.
No problem. So the next couple are common sense, keeping it simple and documenting well. But I'm always stunned by the fact that I see all these sites where I go to help people and there's no documentation. And so we're going to talk a little bit about easy ways to do that. Using dual VIO, using VIO commands, all of these things here we're going to go into. Backups are actually particularly contentious because most people forget. What I see when people put in new installations, they remember that they have to back up their data. They forget about their operating systems and they forget about their VIO servers and their HMCs. So we're going to talk about that because if you don't have those backups, you certainly can't restore. We'll talk about resources. We'll talk about storage. I always like to stress the difference between zoning and mapping because when you have to talk to storage admins, you need to know the difference. And we'll talk about updates, NTP, and we'll talk about firmware. I do have an article that I had published on using NIM with the VIO server, so I put a link into that, and hopefully you'll find that useful. So I'm going to start out by talking about a patching order. you should be patching pretty much your environment every 6 months at the latest. And I realize that that's very difficult. I just recently had to work on servers that had not been rebooted for 768 days. That is a very frightening reboot to do. And you know they didn't have an up-to-date backup of the environment from when it was last rebooted. So I always try to get people to at least reboot within a backup cycle, but also to make sure they do patching. And there's an order. And the first order is read all the readmes for everything you're planning on updating. And make sure that there's nothing in the README that says you have to do a specific order or you have to be at a specific minimum level. I always do my HMC first unless the READMEs say otherwise. And then I do my server firmware if I can. And the reason is that quite often the server firmware depends on the HMC being at a very specific level. And then the next thing I do is my NIM server. And I always do my NIM server first out of all of my LPARs, because if I'm patching everything, for instance, to 7252, I need the NIM server to be at 7252 with all the NIM resources built in order to be able to restore my VIO server or my LPARs if they're at that level. And then I do my VIO servers and any IO firmware, etc. And another comment on the NIM server is I do not let my NIM server be an LPAR under the control of VIO. It normally has its own network card and its own fiber card. And the reason for that is its purpose for me is to back up and restore my VIO servers. Well, if they're under the control of the VIO servers, then I can't boot them to restore the VIO servers. So whenever I architect an environment, I always add an extra fiber card and an extra network card for my NIM server. And I document everything. In fact, when I'm doing upgrades, I have about a 30-page document for a system, for a VIO install, about the same for an AIX one. And I have another document that I use for my upgrades. And I pre-document every step before I even start. Now, I've been doing it long enough. I have all the documents. So usually it's a case of taking a document and renaming everything as I go in the document, which is what I mean by tweaking. But these are things that will save you a lot of grief and will make for much, much faster updates. And I'm often doing these at 2 or 3 in the morning. So having it all pre-documented just makes it so much easier because I pretty much don't have to think as much. So let's talk a little bit about staying current. Now, so this is the IBM document that shows you what the current supported levels are. It gives you the release date, it gives you the end of support or service support date. And if you notice, if you go down the bottom to 31130, everything prior to that by November this year is going to be out of support. So if you're not on 31210 or higher on your VIO, come the end of November, you will be out of support. Now you can get the extended support, but you're much better to upgrade. If you're on 226, you've been out of support since 2020. So you really want to get yourself to version 3. And this is just the document IBM has published with their VIO server level of service lifetimes. So you could see that if you go to 312 now, you're pretty good till sometime in 2023 for service packs and so on. So in terms of VIO server levels, 31210 came out, I think it was earlier this year or late last year. The latest level is 31221, which is based on AIX 7.2.5.2, and that came out in April this year. I've got it installed right now on about 20 VIO servers. It's extremely stable. If you were at 31210, you had at least 9 hyper patches that you had to put on. On this one, until a week ago, there was only 1, and now there's 2, and I'll go into those later. But basically, you can download the flash copy. I no longer download both VIO DVDs. I just use the flash copy. It's a single DVD image, and it comes with a single combined makes this be And I have a presentation that goes into this in a lot more detail, but basically the thing you want to know is go to ESS and just get the flash copy. It comes as an ISO image, and you can then use loop mount to mount it and do whatever you need to do. And you can also, if you're at 31210, you can go to Fix Central and just download the service pack for 31221, and that will get you the patches that you need. Just be aware that your NIM server needs to be at 7.2.5.2 in order to be able to support backing up and restoring a 31221 VIOS server. There are some prerequisite HMC firmware levels, and you have to be at least a D model Power 7 and above to be supported. One other comment is when you're bringing in new servers, you need to make sure you read the red book, and so that you double check what the VIO server levels and HMCs are. And we just got caught just recently, actually, because IBM changed the firmware they're shipping the Power 9s at. So prior to about 2 months ago, they were being shipped with the 940 firmware. And so your HMC could still be at 940. More recently, they are shipping them with the 950 firmware. Your HMC must be updated to 950, which is a problem for some people because the 950 firmware is only supported on the Power HMCs and the Intel CR9 HMC, 7042-CR9. And initially it wasn't supported on that. So if you're bringing in Power 9s, you have any HMC below the CR9, you're going to need a new HMC. And I highly recommend going with the Power HMC. And they just brought out a brand new Power HMC as well. So there's now there's a 7063 CR1, there's now a CR2. And I know Nigel has a YouTube up doing a little tour of it. So just be aware of that if you're bringing in new boxes, you could get caught with an HMC update unexpectedly. But definitely read the latest Red Book. I always download the latest one when I get a new server because they update them, and cross-check all the prereqs. Okay, this is a slide I updated, so I'm going to be sending a new set of slides to Jaqui so that I can get this uploaded. So I had said that as of about a week or so ago, there were 9 hyperfixes to go on 31210, and there was only one for 31221, which is this patch for NPIV IO errors. Since I make extensive use of NPIV, I make sure to do that patch. There was one that was just added, and it has to do with Cisco MDS zoning changes. So there are now 2 patches to go on your VIO server. You need to be aware of these. Additionally, I make extensive use of the fixed level recommendation tool, and then there's another one, the fixed level recommendation tool vulnerability checker. I've got links here to the home pages and to FlirtLite. There is a VIO server to NIM master mapping page that shows you the VIO server level and the NIM level. It has not been updated since October 2019, and I've raised an issue on that with IBM because people really depend on this. So right now your go-to is going to be the README for the VIO server because it actually states in there explicitly what the NIM level is. There's a number of other things here like the security tables and hypertables. So let's talk about installing hypers and other fixes. So I mentioned that I update Java, SSH, and SSL. That's because they are installed on your VIO server, and typically they are back level. In fact, I just installed new VIO servers and I still had to patch Java, SSH, and SSL. So what I do is I pull out the file sets that I want for SSH, SSL, and Java, and I put them in their own directory, which in this case is called user local soft Java, SSH, SSL. I only put the language file sets in that I want, and typically it's going to be the SDK and the JRE for the Javas. And then I use update iOS, which is how you're supposed to do things, and I pointed at my directory, the Java SSH SSL directory, and it installs them. I also, once you get to version 3, you no longer need Java 6, and as of 3.10.21, you don't need Java 7 either. So you can use Update iOS to remove them. And so I have that in there for you. But this is the way that you should put patches into your VIO server. So let's say you have some EMC or HDS drivers you need to install. You would put those in their own directory, and then you would use Update iOS to install them. It is not recommended that you use SMIDI to do installs on your VIO servers unless there is absolutely no other way. So this is the way that you really want to do it. The one exception is, of course, efixes and ifixes, because there is no equivalent to eManager that I'm aware of for the VIO server. So what I do is I use the FlirtVC tool, the Flirt Fixed Level Recommendation Tool Vulnerability Checker. It's a mouthful. And I run that on my VIO. Now, what that tool does is it goes to IBM, it tries to download a file using FTP called hyper_security.csv, and then it renames it to apar.csv. That's a list of every known hyper, and it then goes through your system and checks them against that file. So what you may have to do, if your VIO server does not have access to go out to IBM using FTP, you may have to download that file yourself and then upload it to your VIO server, and then you change the script that you have to run to basically say skip download equals 1, and then it will just use the local file. If you have to do it that way, you need to remember to re-download that file periodically. And I use the same methodology on my VIOs as I do on my AIX LPARs. You run eManager L to list the ones you have installed. eManager-P with a capital will actually list the packages and the patches, and the packages they affect. So it will actually tell you that what it's impacting is this specific file set. And then pretty much you go to the directory that it's in and you run eManager. The -P says run it in preview mode, and then this is the package name. And then when you want to run it for real, if it's successful, you just remove the -P. And if you look on your VIO server, if you run eManager-L or eManager-P and it lists no fixes, then I can guarantee you that you have security holes. And if you then run FlirtVC on that VIO, I'll almost guarantee it'll call out Java, OpenSSH, OpenSSL, and depending on the level you're at, there's a number of NPIV fixes. So again, as I said, unless you're on 3.12.12 where there's only 3.12.21, sorry, where there's only 2 patches, you're going to be looking at a lot of patching. And this is just showing you like what it was for 3.11.25. So something else to think about when you're doing VIO server updates. I mean, I've been very fortunate, apart from at the very, very beginning when I was doing the very first version 3 updates. I've pretty much got it down to a fine art now, but you do need to know how to get help. And there's steps that they're going to ask you to take, so you might as well be familiar with them ahead of time. So one of the things that IBM will ask you for quite often is a perf PMR. So what I always do is when I'm doing updates, I keep an updated version of the perf PMR code on all my systems. So I make sure that I have that, and then I test it so I know how to run it, and so I know how to upload it before I have to actually do it. I'll also quite often run a perf PMR, and this is on AIX as well as the VIO servers, before I do an update and after I do an update, so I have before and after information. You also should know how to run a snap, and it's a little bit different on a VIO server than it is on AIX, so I've got the links here for you for that. And you need to know how to upload it to test case. These are all the things that if you open any kind of a support ticket on a VIO server, or usually even on AIX, IBM's going to ask you for. So I like to save myself time, and I like to save myself interactions with support. I open all my cases through the web and put everything in there. And if I think there's any chance they're going to want a snap, I just take the snap and upload it immediately. That way, they don't have to ask me for it. There's also for VIO servers, they'll ask you for a lot of information. So you really want to make sure that you have it well documented. It's going to go beyond VIO server levels and so on. So I have very, very good documentation. I have multi-tab spreadsheets that document all my VIO servers. It's the only way you can keep track of all the VFC hosts and everything.
Jackie, there's a couple of questions. So these might have been from a couple of slides ago. The first question is, does IBM support patching the SSH SSL outside of their official VIO updates?
Given that IBM provides the SSH SSL updates through their website, I'm going to say yes. I've never had an issue with them questioning my SSH SSL as long as I update it using Update iOS. So I can't speak for what IBM will or won't do, but I have never found it to not be supported, and I've never found anything that says it is not. And I don't think IBM would want to be responsible if I didn't patch it and I had a problem.
Mm-hmm.
You actually download the code from the IBM web software page, and you can actually get it through Fix Central.
Okay. And then one more, Mark says, upgrading VIOS when VMR, HA or DR is installed is more difficult or much difficult. Not always VMR fix for, the fix for VMR is not always available for VIOS when a new VIOS version release is available. Is it possible to add a section to the README with instructions how to update VIOS if VMR fix install is in it?
So I think that's really one for IBM, not for me.
Yeah,
I should say, because a lot of people get confused. I don't work for IBM, and I've actually never worked for IBM. I've spent a lot of money with IBM, so I can't answer questions about what IBM can or can't do. But that would be something that I would. I think there's a process for requesting that kind of thing, but it
yes,
would make sense to me that there should be something in the README if that's becoming an issue for people.
yes, there's a request for enhancement, which is more for product, if you want different features or new features in a product. But this, I think, would be more suitable to go via the feedback link on a IBM support website. So I'll put the IBM support website details on the chat.
And I just saw you had to correct the link for the NIM presentation. Yeah, I'll update that in the presentation before I send it to you. They've moved everything. I've actually started loading stuff to my own website because they keep moving everything on me and I can't find it myself.
I know the feeling.
Yeah. Well, doesn't IBM stand for I've been moved?
Yes, it certainly does.
Yeah, so.
I don't see any others, but yes, carry on and I'll look out for more questions.
Yeah, I mean, just interrupt at any time. It's not a problem.
Sure. Great.
I don't get stressed by that anymore. Pretty much anything that could have gone wrong has gone wrong in presentations, so it is what it is. Anyway, okay.
I will do.
So keeping it simple and consistent. I find there are so many cool things you can do. So many. And I like to test them in a lab environment, but I've been doing installs where people have wanted to have multiple network virtual switches and all that kind of stuff. And they get into these incredibly complex environments that are unnecessarily complex. And the problem with that is at some point something will go wrong and you have to figure it out. And if you don't have good documentation and things are overly complex, it's going to be a nightmare to figure out. I've gotten to the point with some of my clients where I literally color code everything by VIO because they have 6 VIO servers and 6 different virtual networks, and you're supposed to keep track of all that stuff. So keeping it as simple as you can. This ensuring that LMB, that's the logical memory block size, or what you sometimes will see referred to as the memory region option. If you want to do that and use LPM, that has to be the same on all the servers that you're LPMing between. So that's something, as soon as I put in the new server, I check that what the LMB size is. Typically nowadays it's defaulting to 256 meg, but that's not always the case. Oh, good, you posted that marketing link for that. Yeah, OpenSSH and OpenSSL you download from the marketing link, and the Java you download from the IBM Fix Central. Okay, using hot pluggable adapters rather than the built-in ones. If you want to use LPM, you've got to use hot pluggable adapters, but also they're easier for maintenance. And that leads to making sure that your adapters are desired, not required. If you have the adapters as required, it affects LPM, but more importantly, it makes it very difficult to do maintenance on them. So I always make adapters desired. I have no required adapters. Using dual VIO, we're going to talk about that more, but if you want to be able to update your VIOs live, which I do all the time, you need to have dual VIOs, and you need to make sure that when zoning and mapping and all those things are done, that it's done correctly so that the network works properly across both VIOs and that the storage does. And you need to test that stuff. Something else you have to be very careful with is the VLANs on the trunk adapters. If you don't have them identical, the second VIO won't boot. You'll boot the first VIO and you'll be fine, but when the second one tries to come up, it notes that the trunk adapters don't match and just won't boot. I never mix multipath drivers on HBAs. I keep my tape on a separate adapter port. Just common sense kinds of things. And I am a huge fan of the HMC scanner tool. And I also use sysplan. So when I'm doing changes beforehand, I'll go to the HMC and pull a sysplan, print it to a PDF. And I'll also run an HMC scanner report, and I do the same thing when I'm done. It's a great piece of documentation. I use HMC scanner all the time. I talked earlier about, I like to do updates every 6 months. At least try to plan for one a year, and it needs to get into your cycle. Also, when you're doing updates, one of the things you want to be very careful about, particularly if getting windows is really difficult. I've had situations where they get one window a year, and the database people, the storage people, the network people, and all the AIX people and everybody use the same window. Well, I can tell you that it's pretty tragic if the storage people pull the storage out from underneath you while you're in the middle of an LPM because you're trying to evacuate a kick so you can put the firmware on. So you need to make sure that whatever the window is that you have, that it's your window and there are no other people messing with the network. The one that's gotten me a couple of times is that I do a lot of things through Citrix. And I was in the middle of a major upgrade when they decided to do a Citrix upgrade and pulled my Citrix out from under me halfway through a VIO update. So make sure that when you've got these windows, that you actually have at least one a year that is dedicated to you. I mentioned before having dual VIOs. You can actually have more than 2. A lot of people will separate VIOs for one pair for network and one pair for storage, or they'll have a pair for production and a pair for non-prod. It's entirely up to you how you do it, but at least 2 of them, and they should be properly paired. And this last thing is testing failover. One of the things that I've learned to do to make sure that my shared Ethernet adapter and disk I/O is working is I'll install my VIOs and I'll install my test LPAR. And then I will reboot one VIO to make sure I still have a network and I still have storage. And then I will reboot the other VIO to make sure I still have a network and I still have storage. Because if something's not correct with the aggregates or the network, it is possible that VIO2, as an example, thinks it has a fully functional network until you reboot VIO1. So I always test my failover, and then I start building everything. I've talked about using VIO commands. You know, a lot of people just go to OEM setup in and use SMIDI and brute force through. That's not the recommended way to do it. That is a fallback plan if nothing else works, but it's not how you should do it. If you're on internal disk, you should mirror root VG, and you should always have a spare disk in your VIO to use for cloning. So as an example, if I'm on internal disk, I'll mirror root VG, but when I go to do maintenance, I unmirror it and I use alt disk copy to create a clone prior to the update so that I have a very, very fast failback. And then when I'm done, a couple of weeks later, when I'm happy, I remirror root VG. If you're booting from SAN, you really need at least 100 gig for your root VG because you're going to need some page space. Hopefully you'll never page. The default page spaces on the VIO server are incorrect. Depending on what version you get, you'll get 2 page spaces on the same LUN, which is a physical disk in many cases. And I usually get rid of paging 00 and make HD6 4 gig. So I also add logging and I set up my dump devices properly because they're too small. A couple of other things to think about. Running the part command regularly, that's the VIO server advisor. That will actually give you information on how the VIO server is behaving. And then these next 3, checking ERRPT. I can't tell you how many times someone's called me with a problem and I've logged in, I've run ERRPT, and the problem is exactly defined. You know, it basically says you lost all your disk or something happened. So always check ERRPT before you place a service call. And yeah, someone just mentioned that setting it up so that ERRPT gets regularly emailed to you from the VIO server is priceless, and that's true. You can have a little cron job that runs that sends you an email about it, however you want to do it. So the next one about running at 100% entitlement is something you need to think about. It turns out that your VIO servers and specifically your network scale by entitlement, not by VPs. So if you set your entitlement too low, you're actually impacting your network performance. And the problem with that is when you do that, you impact all of your clients. So I always make sure that my VIO servers have plenty of entitlement, more than they need. And the other thing is, of course, paying attention to the memory because you do not want your VIO servers paging. If your VIO server is unhappy, none of the other LPARs are going to be happy. So it's really important to pay attention to that. And taking backups. I don't care if you use NIM, if you use scripts, if you take a regular alt disk copy, but you need to take a backup of your VIO server. And people forget about that. And there's specific kinds of backups that you should take. Now, let me just check the chat because I saw a few things pop up. I can find it. There we go. So you answered the one on the HMC scanner.
There was one about shouldn't the recommendation be to use HMC for 90% of this, given the new versions and features of the HMC?
So I'm going to talk to some of the new stuff in the HMC in a little bit, but the HMC doesn't give you the ability to take offsite backups of your VIO servers and stuff. So I also don't want to be in a situation where I have to do a restore when I can do a reboot. So I still do the alt disk copies before I do maintenance. And then Russell added the comment about sending the VIO emails that you can do it with the ODM shim, and that's true.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I think that's all I have.
Yeah, hang on one sec. Sorry, I had to cough.
Oh, no worries.
All right, let's talk about documentation. I've talked about the HMC scanner and the sys plan. I actually have a spreadsheet that normally the first page is a list of all the equipment, the serial numbers. For the servers, I keep track of the UAK expiration dates. That's the access key for getting firmware. And yes, I'm well aware that 950 has a backup capability for VIO server. I'm going to talk about that. I also track the customer numbers because sometimes you need those, server IO firmware levels, all that kind of stuff. The other thing that you'll need to start tracking with your HMC is more than the version. The HMC, Power HMC, now has an additional component called the BMC and PNOR. And that's basically a baseboard controller, similar to the IPMI on some of the Intel boxes. And you now have to also update that. What's nice is that it also has its own IP address, and you can basically telnet to it and watch your HMC booting, which is something you were never able to do before. So you do have to patch that BMC and PNOR. And I have a couple of articles published that actually allow you to that go through the actual processes. I track the IP addresses, the profiles, the adapter allocations, and the stuff that's really complicated. I actually have a section that's just my standards. What are my standards? I always use the same adapter numbers for the network. I always use, I have a set that I use for vSCSI from VIO1 and the set I use for vSCSI from VIO2, and the same with the NPIVs. Now, granted, once you start doing LPM, it starts changing them all anyway, but at least I have a plan for when I start. I actually keep the VFC map commands in that document. And I keep track of the VFC host and all the WWPNs. I mean, you can see I pretty much try to track as much as I can. I also try to get the network and SAN people to give me the switch ports for everything so that I have that in the document. So that I have one place where I keep everything, and it's a pain in the neck to set up, but trust me, later on you'll be very grateful you took the time, because I get questions today about stuff I set up 4 years ago that no one's touched because they're all scared of it. And I can go back to the documentation, and then I do a rationality check against an HMC scanner, and I have the information they need without having to spend hours going and recreating it. So let's talk a little bit about dual VIO servers. What dual VIO servers allows you to do is do concurrent updates, and basically you can update one VIO and reboot it while the other one is still running. As I said, you do need to test failover. The one thing that you have to pay attention to with dual VIOs is if you're using the internal disks, you need to make sure the server has a split backplane. And then you put 2 of the disks on one side, 2 on the other. Each VIO can have one of the backplanes. What I see with a lot of the smaller servers is people don't get the split backplane, and then they end up having one VIO that has to control everything, or one VIO booting from SAN. And you can do that, but it's not the best practice. So that's one of the questions you should ask when you're buying a server. If you're planning on doing dual VIOs, which hopefully you are, make sure that the server, if it's like an S922, has a split backplane, and that you get at least 4 internal disks. I like to get 6. The reason for that is I have 2 for each VIO, and the additional 2 I use for file-backed optical, so that I can store all my ISO images, and I usually use VIO2 and put those 2 disks in there. The reason I do that is, number one, I have a bad habit of losing ISO images, and I lose CDs. So if I load them all up to my file-backed optical, I can find them, and then I can use that file-backed optical to basically do installs from if I don't have a NIM server. The dual VIO gives you a lot more redundancy, flexibility, and like I said, you have a lot of options for having one pair managing everything, or splitting the network and so on. And someone just asked if I prefer internal or SAN disk for the VIO servers. So I prefer internal disk only because I know my VIO servers will always boot if the SAN guys destroy my SAN or something happens. Having said that, I'm about to install a server that has, I think it's 6 VIO servers, and they all boot from SAN. So basically, I don't really care. I mean, I prefer it to be internal only because it's easier for me. Otherwise, I have to go get the WWNs ahead of time and then deal with the storage people to be able to even get my VIOs working. But either way works just fine. The only difference is if something happens with your storage connections, you will not be booting your VIO servers. So, for what it's worth.
There's another question come to me directly. do you know any additional reasons to keep Java 8 on the VIO server, except for the performance advisor? Because this person used to remove it completely.
You know, so when I've done my updates, it has forced me to install Java 8. So you would have, that would really be a question that I would open with support as to why. But I don't bother uninstalling it because it seems to be required. Java 7 you can remove, Java 6 you can remove. I've never tried removing Java 8.
Okay.
I just saw something else come up.
Yes, we will be getting RAID 0 with internal and have to change it to different RAID, like RAID 5 with dual VIOS, question mark?
No, so what you're going to have, you will have, let's say you got 4 disks in there, and they're all going to be P disks, and they get changed over to H disks, which are basically RAID zeros. And I don't change them from RAID 0 because I'm going to mirror them anyway. So I don't do RAID 5 or any of that stuff because I want to have 2 individual disks at each VIO. I just mirror within the VIO. Yeah. Yeah, so it's someone just posted Java 7 for 226, Java 8 for VIO 3.1 are required for VIO's core functions, including the HMC management, and they do not support you removing Java 8. Thank you, Hubert.
Thank you.
All right. So using VIO commands for maintenance, please do. When you're doing updates, and an update is like going from 3.12.10 to 3.12.21 or 3.1, basically staying within a version, you're going to use the update iOS command and you're going to point it at a directory. So I go get my patches, I load all the BFFs in here, run an in-utoc, and then I do my update iOS. You'll quite often have to do an update iOS -commit before you do that if you have not committed all your patches previously. Going from version to version requires use of the VIOS upgrade command. You have 2 choices. You can use the VIOS upgrade command on your VIO server, or you can do it from NIM, which also has a VIOS upgrade command, which does not have the same syntax. So my advice to you is pick one. I typically do my VIOS upgrades right on the VIO server, but and then I use NIM to back it up later, but it's entirely up to you which way you do it. But there is a difference, as I said, if you're doing a version to version, you're doing an upgrade, not an update. If you need to update Java, SSH, and SSL, like I said, I've talked about this before. I have a specific Java SSH, SSL directory for the VIO servers because all I need for the VIO for Java is the SDK and the JRE. I don't ever put all the language sets on because they just take up a lot of space and they offer no value to me. So I have a very specific directory that I put them in. And then, as I said, the only exception for VIO commands is having to use eManager for your hyper patches and your IO firmware updates, which are done using the diag command. Pretty much everything else you should be able to do using a VIO server command. Okay, now we're going to talk about backups. Whenever I'm making changes, I take a copy with Alt Disk Copy ahead of time. And the reason for that is if it all goes south, I point the boot list at the other disk and I reboot and I'm back. If I take a backup and want to do a restore, whether I take the backup to the HMC, to my NIM server or wherever, I have to go through a full restore process rather than just a reboot. So my process is always, I still take a backup because I'm paranoid, but I will also do the Alt Disk Copy. If the root VG is mirrored, I unmirror it for the maintenance. I take my copy and I also run the boot info-b beforehand to make sure that the disk I'm booted from, that I think is root VG, is really the disk I booted from. And I always, before I do any kind of a reboot, I will do a boss boot and I'll rewrite my boot list. I've been caught too many times with a corrupted boot list. So depending on how long it's been since this VIO was rebooted, I may rewrite the boot list. I may rewrite the boot image with boss boot, rewrite the boot list, and then boot the VIO before I change anything. And yes, you can use export VG. The recommendation nowadays is to use alt root VG op. So that you use that for the exports instead. And as I said, the nice thing about the alt disk copy is that it's a very, very easy recovery because it's just a point the boot list and reboot.
There's one other question that came up, Jackie. How frequently do you update the alt boot disk?
So if I do a VIO server update today, and I mean, I'll probably wait about a week and then I'll make them match. And other than that, I do it when I'm doing changes because in between times, I don't have to do it very often. But if it was a mirrored root VG, then I want to put it back to the mirror at some point. So depending on if it's internal disk, about a week later, I remirror. If it's on SAN, I never mirror them because you don't need to mirror on the SAN, but I will take another alt disk copy. So usually within 1 to 2 weeks after the updates, because I know I'm not going back.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I do the same thing with AIX as well.
Okay.
So IBM has a published list, which needs to be updated now, of supported backup and restore methods for the VIO servers. And I bring this up because I get asked all the time about backing up to and from USB. Because you can do it with AIX, but it is not supported for the VIO server. You have tape, DVD RAM, the backup iOS command version that does basically a NIM resources tar image that you can use to restore from the HMC using install iOS, or a regular makes a SB image that can go to a remote file system. Those are the things that they support. And then there's a new one with 950 that we'll get to in a minute. So I want to make this really clear because there's a lot of confusion over the USB sticks. I just installed a VIO server from a USB stick, but I can't back up and restore to it, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but that's how it is. So with that said, I have a backup script that I put in cron tab because I back up my VIOs at least twice a month to my NIM server. And it basically mounts an NFS backup file system, and it does both kinds of backups. The one that creates me a NIM resources tar file, and the one that creates me a real makes a SB image. You notice that I unmount /var/vio/vm library. That's the file-backed optical repository. And there's been a bug for a while where if that's in root VG and you don't unmount it, even though I put -no media lib, which says don't back it up, it still backs it up. So I cheat and I unmount it, run my backups and remount it. And that seems to get around the problem. And it's possible it's been fixed more recently, but I haven't double checked it for probably 6 months. So whatever flavor of this that you use, this basically takes my backups for me, and I already have it set up automatically to take a backup every day of the virtual images using VIOS/BR. So that all gets included in these backups. Like I said, I put it in a roots cron tab to run regularly. So chat keeps disappearing on me. So somebody was just asking about upgrading from 224.
Mm-hmm.
You have to get to at least 22632, possibly higher now, in order to be able to upgrade to version 3. So you will have to do at least a double update, and it might be a triple, where you go from whatever you're on to get to 226.32 or higher. Then you'll need to, and let that, I usually let that run for a couple of weeks. And then you'll be looking at another one, which is an upgrade iOS to whatever the highest version 3 is you can go to from a flash image. And then you may have to patch it to 3.12.21. 3.12.21, yeah. So it's either going to be a 2 or a 3 stage. And I can't remember, I think you can go safely from 2.24 to 2.26. I'd have to go look at all my notes. I've done so many upgrades, they start to run together. But it's going to be at least a 2, if not 3 stage upgrade. And the safest way to do it, as I said, is take that alt disk copy and take a backup before you start. All right. So I've got a note about adding an NFS mount. Another comment, and this is like AIX in general, and I see it all the time. I never set up any NFS mount to mount automatically. I always do mount equals no. I don't let them mount at boot. What I do is if I have something that has to be mounted at boot, at the very bottom of my init tab, I have a 2://etc/rc.local, and in rc.local I have my mount commands. The reason that I do that is if you have mount equals yes, it will try to do the NFS mounts when /etc/rc.nfs runs. And that is what's called a 2:wait. What that means is that while rc.nfs is running, nothing else is going to run until it ends. And it won't end until every mount is successful or times out. And if you have a whole bunch of mounts, you could be waiting 15 minutes for every mount to time out. You've got 6 of those, you're waiting an hour and a half. So I don't let anything mount at boot by default. Instead, as I said, I have a script that runs at the end, and by making it a 2:once, I don't wait on it, and it just does the mount commands. So just a heads up on that, because I don't automatically mount my user local backups or my user local software anyway. I mount them manually when I want to use them. But just think about that as you move forward. And the one thing I do pretty religiously is I grab an HMC scanner report. Before and after changes, sometimes just for fun, but I make sure I keep my HMC scanner reports up to date. Because that to me is the quickest and easiest documentation. I mentioned the VIOS BR backups. Right, someone just made a point that if you're running a VIOS firewall, you need to shut it down before you use NFS. Good point. So I used to basically run a VIOS BR backup before I did maintenance, which I still do, but there's a command you can enter, which is this VIOS BR-backup. You give it a file name, which is usually for me the VIOS server name, and I tell it to do it every day and keep the last 7. So what's nice about that is it throws this entry into Chrome, and it will basically create a VIOS BR backup, and it will keep the last 7 copies. And if you use VIOS BR to view them, these are the kind of names you'll see, and they go into /home/padmin/config backups. So you can do an ls-l on that and you'll see your backups. So you don't have to remember to run them. When you do a version 3 upgrade from version 2, one of the first things it does is does its own custom backup of those, and you'll see one pop up in home padmin config backups. So if you look at what I've got in the Chrome tab, on the 1st and 15th of the month at 3 a.m., I run a VIO backup. And the reason I have a backup and a backup 0 is because those 2 scripts just have different file names in them, so that I don't. So my one from the 15th will overwrite my one from the month before on the 15th. Because I don't want to fill up all my file systems. These backups can be really big. They can take 40 minutes. They can take 40 gig while they're building, and then they reduce down. So just watch for that. And then you can see the last one is my VIOS BR backup that runs at midnight. Now this is the thing everybody's been posting entries about, this HMC 950 update. And I actually tested this the other day. So thank you, Manjanath, for posting this. The HMC 950 has some new functions which we've all been waiting for. And one of them is an IO configuration backup. So you can actually go in there and you can tell it to back up your VIO server IO configuration. And that's that VIOS BR, and it will back it up to the HMC. And you also have the ability to do a proper a VIO server backup and store it on the HMC, and then you can use it to restore. The thing you want to watch out for is you only have about 15 gig on the HMC. So I haven't been doing a lot of testing with this yet because I just got to 950. So I did the VIOS BR one, but I haven't had time to do the VIO server backup one. But I'm thinking you could very easily and very quickly run out of space. So it's definitely something worth knowing about and definitely worth having. But again, the 950 HMC requires the CR9 or the new Power HMCs. Someone just asked about whether it works on the virtual HMC. I'd have to double check the README. I think it works on the Power virtual HMC. So resources. We talk about giving the VIO plenty of resources. And I've already mentioned this before. Your VIO is your most loved one. It is the most important LPAR. Both of them are the most important LPARs in your environment, because if they're not happy, nobody's happy. So I give it the highest weight. It gets 254. I usually do something like 254. I might do critical production at 192, maybe some other things at 160. The default is 128. I pretty much don't have anything below 128. It's entirely up to you what you do, but my VIO, I always give it the highest weight. Now, you don't need to worry about weights if you give your VIO dedicated cores, but you do need to worry about weights if you go above entitlement. I always give my VIO plenty of entitlement. I monitor it religiously with NMON, and when I see that it's starting to go above entitlement too much, I'll give it more entitlement. It's not that it should never go above entitlement, but you don't want to see it regularly going above entitlement, because that is affecting your network performance. I also tune my virtual buffers on the VIO as well as all the clients. I tune my HBA settings. We'll talk about that. And like I said, I monitor it with NMON. All my systems, I run a 724 NMON. Every night at midnight, it kicks off a 24-hour NMON that it saves so that I can go back and look. So this is an example of what I might use to tune my Etsy tunables. This is what I use to tune my network and my memory and stuff. I use these by default. So wherever I put my IP, I'll set TCP receive and send if it's not already set. Sometimes it depends on when you actually put the IP on as to whether it uses the default settings or not. And I also tune my fiber adapter, num command elements, etc. You should be aware that the VIO server has to be running the highest number of settings for these max transfer size and num command elements. If you set an LPAR to 2048 for num command elements and the VIOs at 1024, your LPAR will not boot. So you need to know what your VIOs are set to. I ran into this in the cloud recently because I wanted to do some tuning of my HBAs, and I had to actually go to the cloud team and ask them what their VIOs were set to. And they were like, why do you want to know? Like, because I'm going to set my LPAR to this, and if it doesn't boot, that's your fault. So they finally came back and told me what they were using. So just be aware that it's not just a case of setting it on the VIO, you also have to reboot the VIO to make sure that that's taken. I also tend to tune my buffers because I keep running out of virtual buffers. And so I go and do all my virtuals. You could leave that if you want and then do it later. I tend to do it up front because I like to avoid problems. I make the same tuning changes in terms of my HBAs that I would make on AIX, but as I said, the VIO has to be set to at least as high as the clients. And this is an example of the commands to change them. You need to make sure they're supported by your disk vendor. So if you want to go higher than that, like 2048 or 4096, check with your disk vendor, make sure it's supported. And I already mentioned the
Jackie.
client. Yeah.
Sorry, it was just one other question regarding tuning. Do you use the VIO rules to deploy the latest BP settings after each update?
So no, I'm very guilty of not using the VIO rules. I probably should, but I've never gotten around to actually testing them out. So I have two scripts that I run that basically do this for me automatically. But there's no reason you couldn't do this with VIO rules. I just honestly just haven't bothered. So.
And just a quick note to our participants, this is a 90-minute session, so we will be continuing until 1:30, so another 30 minutes or so. And the session is being recorded, so if you should need to leave, then you can catch the replay, but hope that you will be able to stay on. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I've got a comment about paying attention to adapter layout and priorities. I am one of these people that sits there and maps out my VIO servers and my LPARs and looks at every adapter slot and what the highest priority ones are and what the lowest priority ones are. And I actually make IBM or whoever's installing the server move the adapters to where I want them so that I get the best potential performance and redundancy. So, you know, I may design things across drawers or I may design them across buses and stuff like that. But I actually sit down and I do that before the box ever hits the floor. I stopped using there's a thing that allows you to request that IBM put the adapters in a certain thing when they're building it. I stopped asking for that because it added like 4 weeks and they still turned up wrong. So I just have whoever's doing the physical install move them. But I do pay a lot of attention to adapter layout and so on, because that can make a bit of a difference. There was, for a while there was a restriction on your virtual fiber clients, which is your AIX and other LPARs, what you could set num command alums to. That's since changed depending on what version of AIX you're on. So just a note on that. You can now make it higher. This is just a note on the max transfer size, where the default that comes is this, what is it, 100,000. And that, which is a 16 meg DMA. I always bump it to 2 to get a 128 meg DMA. It turns out that AIX, even if you've got one, tends to use 128. I like to make sure it matches, so I just do that. You can have much, much larger sizes, but unless you're doing really, really large IOs, it's unlikely that you're going to need more than a 128 meg DMA. So I typically set it to 0x200000. And of course, like I said before, VIOs first and booted. All right. So someone just commented that 312 sets it to 0x40000. I haven't actually seen that. I just installed a bunch of 31221s and I didn't see that, but I'll go back and I'll double check. Storage zoning and mapping. So it's really important to understand the difference between zoning and mapping when you're talking to storage people. Zoning is what they do at the switch that allows the switch to talk to the storage and the worldwide port number or worldwide number for the LPAR server. I use WWNs when I'm referring to the real adapters. So that's the actual adapter that's in your VIO server or your LPAR. And they normally start with a 10 or a 20. I use the term WWPN when I'm referring to the NPIV worldwide port numbers, and they typically start with a C0. Your storage people will use WWPNs for both. So they may use either term, so you need to make sure when you're talking to them that you're very clear about what you're doing, because it makes a difference to when you go to light things up for them. And what I found is that even though I provide the WWPNs to the storage people, they don't want to type them in. They want to actually see them before they do the zoning and the mapping. Now, mapping is also called masking. That's when you go to the storage subsystem and you go to the actual LUNs that you've built and you say, these WWPNs can access these LUNs. You need both zoning and mapping to be done in order to be able to get to the disk. And sometimes they'll do one and forget the other. which is exciting. You can get the WWPNs and WWNs from the HMC scanner once the LPAR has been booted, which is not helpful if the LPAR is booting from SAN. You can also log into the VIOS server or the HMC and get some of it. And then from the HMC, you can now actually go and you can actually light up the WWPNs. And the other thing that you can do is you can actually boot it in SMS mode, and there's an option in there which allows you to enable, basically to light up each adapter so that they can see them. But that one's one at a time. Now, one of the really important things is, I run into this all the time where they tell me everything's cabled, everything's fine. I'm on my VIOS server and I'm not seeing any disk. So I run LSN ports as PAdmin, and if I don't see my fiber ports, then either they're not physically connected or they haven't been zoned, but I can't talk to the switch. And if I can't talk to the switch, I'm certainly not going to be running NPIV. So this, you should see something like this when you run LSN ports, that basically shows you your fiber adapter ports and what the adapter is, and the rest of this is great, but I just really care that I actually see these at all and that they match up with what I pre-documented. I mentioned not confusing zoning with mapping. Everything has to be zoned at the switch and mapped at the storage. And also the other thing that throws the storage people, when you're using LPM, you have two WWPNs. The first is the default one that's used when you boot. The second one is used by LPM and it doesn't normally log in, which means that your storage is going to show that half your paths are degraded, and that is normal, and that freaks storage people out completely. Because the way that it works is when you do an LPM, it switches to using that second WWPN and then it stays booted on that. And then when you LPM somewhere else, it will do the same. Now, one thing to note, and I've run into this before, I did an LPM and they told me the storage was done, so I LPM'd it live, and then I typed in a couple of commands and they failed because they weren't in the cache, and then I couldn't go back. And the problem was that the boot image, it turns out, actually ends up getting stored in the hypervisor. And because I didn't have any disk, it got corrupted and I had to restore my LPAR. So whenever I'm doing LPM, my first test is always I LPM the LPAR shutdown and I make sure I can boot it, because I don't trust anybody when they tell me they've mapped stuff. And then I can basically test it. And then after that, I'll LPM it live. Because if they haven't zoned and mapped both those WWPNs, your LPM is not going to work. After 224, there's a couple of parameters you can set in the VIO around the VIOS LPM 0, and that will do an end-to-end check. So you can also do that. And I also have them, which really annoys them, zone all the WWPNs for the LPAR to both switches. One of the reasons for doing that is because when we LPM will sometimes allocate the fiber ports differently to what you thought they were, and that can cause you problems. So unless you're going to be very anal retentive when you do LPMs and pay attention to exactly which switch each of the WWPNs is on, it's much easier to have a simple zone. And I'm big on simple. I talked about this really quickly. The way
Sorry, there's a few more comments and questions that came through. Let's just take some of those, and others we can leave to the end if you prefer. So let's see.
For some reason I can't see the chat.
No worries, I'll read out what it says. So somebody checked their recent 312 install and it's still set to 0x 100,000. Well, I don't know how to read that, I'm sorry. But the person who said, I think Pete said it had set it to 0x4, has got it at the latest, so 3.1.2.21 flash. and also set num command elements to 4014 using the rules. So that's just some information that came through. A question is, where would you recommend we look to learn more about the best practices of zoning and masking?
So I have a presentation that I gave at PTECU, I think, and I believe it's on my movies site, which there's a link to later. And it's on my YouTube, and it is specifically about LPM, and there's a significant section in there on zoning and masking. And then some of the best practices about, single initiators, et cetera, are going to come from storage sites. And it's going to be very vendor specific. So, but basically learning about what they are and how they work, I know I have a presentation out there that talks about this. With respect to the comments on num command alums, probably the best thing I can say right now is just check it after you do the upgrade, change it if you need to. The point that I was trying to make is you're going to need to tune it.
Mm-hmm.
The VIOS LPM 0 parameter, you should be able to just Google that. That's how I found it initially. And the comment about the leading to both paths going over the same switch, that can happen. So that's why you've got to be very careful when you do your LPMs to make sure. That's why I have the documentation, which is literally for every VFC host, what the adapter number is, what switch it should be on, and I try to make sure that what you're talking about doesn't happen. And and some of that I deal with because I've got dual VIOs, I can also make sure it doesn't happen. So.
And then one last thing.
The last one, I'm not really sure about the question. I don't work with Power VC, so it's I've never used their zoning policies.
Okay.
Sounds like you need a Power VC presentation though.
Yes, indeed. So if Stefano, if you want to send me an email, I can have that looked into. Thank you.
All right. So I talked about LPM's use of the two WWPNs, and basically, as I said, unless you're doing LPM, that second one doesn't get used. What's really interesting is from then on, it will flip-flop between them as you LPM. But if you do an inactive LPM where the LPAR is shut down, and then you bring it up on the new LPAR, so you shut the LPAR down, LPM it, and bring it up, it does not use the second WWPN. It will come up on the first one. That's why it's really important that both WWPNs get zoned and mapped. If any of you have those 10/1 gig network cards, and they show up with these 10 gig FCOE adapters as fiber channels, but you don't use them as fiber channels because it's a network card, you get errors all the time, and it's really annoying. So I look for those converged cards, and I look for the FCS version of it. So you can see here I've got ENT0123 as my converged card, and then FCS 4 and 5 are actually, if I was to use T1 and T2 for fiber channel instead of the network, that's what they would look like. So what I do is I disable them. I basically set them to unconfigured, and they now show as defined. And from then on, I don't get the error messages in the error report because it's not trying to light them up. So it doesn't affect the ENT0 or ENT1 and T1 or T2. It just stops these FCS 4 and 5 errors from flashing up. I also do things like I actually set up logging on my VIO servers. By default, it doesn't really log anything except for some VIO things. I like to have logging. So what I do, I don't do logs to /var or /user. To me, if I do that and I fill up the file system and the server crashes because of var fills up, I don't want to have to explain to management that was because of my logging. So I create a separate file system called /user local logs. And then in etsysyslog.conf, I'll have the logs that I want going to user local logs. I still use compress, and I still use, limit the sizes and keep the last 7 and all that kind of stuff. But I basically have all my logs go to user local logs, except for the ones that the VIO server has automatically, because I don't want to mess with any kind of gathering they do with perf PMR and so on. All right, we're getting there. I talked about having a second disk earlier. If you're on internal disk, you need a mirror root VG. If you're on the SAN, you still have a second disk. We talked about using alt disk copy, and I'm a huge fan of file backed optical. It's kind of like a poor man's NIM, but that lets me add an additional disk in its own volume group, and I can now keep my ISO images there. One of the most important things is keeping your root VG small and clean. You know, I've been running into lately where people have been installing things in operating system file systems, and that really shouldn't be happening. You know, if you have local stuff to do, put it in user local bin or something like that. Make it its own file system. I have a separate /user local file system. But don't go starting to install things in your operating system directories, and keep your root VG small, because if you have to restore it, you want it to be fast. And that's pretty much a general thing, AIX and VIOs. So NTP is the network time protocol. One of the things I found, I used to do a lot of work in security, and there is nothing worse than trying to track a security issue across 4 or 5 different LPARs when nobody set the time correctly on all of them, and you're trying to match up the logs and incidents. It's a nightmare. So what you want to do is you want to use NTP. And assuming that you can like ping 0.pool.ntp.org, then you can use those. Those are the atomic clocks. You could check with your Active Directory or your network people and find out if you have your own NTP servers and point to those. But the point being, I turn off COP broadcast and I give it specific servers to look at. And I do it on the VIO server, it's in 2 places, etsy.ntp.conf and home.padmin config.ntp.conf. I think the only one you have to change is actually the second one. I changed them both because I'm big about consistency. I then run NTP date so that I set my date and time. And then I change RC/TCP/IP to make sure that XNTPD is starting. And that way, from then on, all my log entries and everything are a consistent time. And like I said, I do this on my NTP servers. On the LPARs, it'll be etsy.ntp.conf if they're AIX. It's a different location for Linux, and I have no idea on IBMI. But having consistent time for logs and stuff like that's really important, and it will help you if you have to open a problem with IBM. And you can have problems with things like LPM and so on if your times are way out of sync. So this is actually a very important piece, or at least keeping your time in sync. And then we're going to talk a little bit about IO firmware. So if you run LSM code -A, it's going to give you the status of your firmware. So you'll have to do that as OEM, using OEM setup env on a VIO. It's going to tell you what your server firmware level is, and then what all your adapters are. Now, unfortunately, in order to know whether you're at the latest level or not, you actually have to know the feature code for your IO adapters. And in the quote that you got, they might not have told you that. So you may have to go to IBM's install inventory website and put in your serial number to get those feature codes. And they're going to be things like 5899, EN0H, EN0S. You can then go, well, that's true, the inventory scout and the MUP report can help with that. You can then go to Fix Central and put in the different feature codes and find out what the latest level is. And you can basically download those and then put them on. And you use Diag to install them, whether it's fiber adapters or networks. Now, when you're installing them on the VIO server, when you do it on the fiber adapter, it's going to pull those paths. So again, you need to know that both your VIOs are working and redundant. And with the network, if it's a multi-port card, so that's one of the 4-port 5899s. When you do that, first you have to run the RPM IVH. That actually unpacks it and puts it into /etc/microcode. Then we run Diag, and that actually applies it. For this multi-port adapter, when I did ENT0, it did all 4. Now, you may have to unconfigure the shared Ethernet adapter to do this. It depends. on where you have the IP and how you have it configured. So you may have to down and detach it and rmdev it, and then run config manager at the end once you've done the patch and bring it back up. So obviously this gets done in the maintenance window. But I just want to point out you may have to do that. It depends on how your SCA is configured. Okay, so with that said, that's everything I have for right now. And still got 9 minutes left. I'm doing much better than usual. The presentation will be on the virtual user group. I'm going to send a new copy of the deck, and I'll also update the deck on my site. And this is the movie site that I was talking about that has the LPM and some other presentations on it. And then after this, I have a bunch of links on upgrades and so on, including to ESS, HMC Scanner, and VIOS Advisor. So, all right. We'll pass that to
That's
Sol.
brilliant. That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Jackie. I was just going to say that that's been loads and loads of tips there, taken through in less than 90 minutes. And we've had quite a lot of questions. So hopefully people have learnt quite a lot. There are some questions coming into the chat, and we'll take them in a moment. I just want to highlight what's coming up next time on the PowerWork series. So next month on the 9th of June, same time, same length, so 90 minutes, we've got Doug Mack from IBM Systems Lab Services, and he'll be talking to us about turning data into information with DB2 Web Query for IBM I. So I hope you can join us for that session next time. Okay, so I won't stop the recording just yet as we have a few questions. So if you just bear with me, just get to the last ones that we did. I think when you were talking about time, there was a question about would you not recommend using TRP?
I'm not sure what TRP is.
Okay, it's time and date management with Power VM, time reference partitions.
So I guess the answer would be, since I don't know what it is, I've never used it.
We can look into that one. Well, I can send you a link and we can look into that one.
Yeah, no, I'd be curious. Someone asked about the second patch. I actually did update the deck to include that on one of the slides. So
okay.
I'm going to send I will send the deck to include that, but it was on I know it was on this when I was talking about efixes. I had it.
Okay.
Yeah, it's on slide 8. I basically said that slide 8 or I have to check which slide it was on, but I did have the LPAR, and it was to do with Cisco MDS.
Mm-hmm.
And there was an issue with Cisco MDS, and if they did something with the switch, it would take down your VI. It would take down your storage potentially.
Okay, so look out.
Yeah, it was IJ 31604. Zoning changes in Cisco MDS can cause a 725 client to lose connectivity.
Okay.
I'm just emailing
you.
And
that's on your slide.
Yeah, it's on slide 8. I'm just emailing you the latest deck anyway. So.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. There's a question about what about VIOS monitoring? Do you use any tools like Zabbix?
So I mean, I personally don't, only because, I use what my clients are using. So whatever they have is what we may install. And for the most part, I'm finding more and more that people are basically too scared to do anything on the VIO server. You need to make sure whatever tool that you're using is supported by IBM. But there are people that run Zabbix, there's people that run a number of different tools. it's whatever your standard is, as long as it's supported by IBM.
Okay. There's a kind of question about possible future plans, which I'm not sure you would be able to answer, but are there plans to integrate the VIOS software to the managed system itself, so it acts more like a closed appliance rather than some special virtualization software running on an AIX LPAR? And could this
That's
make...
not me. Sorry.
Yeah.
It's not a bad idea. Although, I don't know, sometimes because it's so critical to the performance, there's a side of me that is actually quite happy that I can tweak it, because I'm not a big fan of taking defaults. But that's just, that's a personal thing. So
yeah, and I really can't comment on what we may or may not announce in the future, but watch this space, and if you feel that this is the way it should go, then feel free to raise a request for enhancement. That would be the way to kind of get it in front of the product developers. So whoever asked that question, that is an option for you. Yes, there was somebody confirming that IJ number for the Cisco thing. Have you seen much use of the shared Ethernet adapter load sharing for VLANs? Any issues?
Yeah. I've seen a lot of use of SEA load sharing for VLANs. I mean, the issues are making sure you set it up properly, and then remembering, when you're doing your reboots of the BIOS and stuff like that, which one's the primary for which VLAN and so on. But no, it works fine. I see a lot of clients using it. I'm also seeing a lot of clients moving to VNIC and stuff. I haven't had a chance to experiment with that, but I know a guy I work with, Sean Bodley, has done a lot of work with VNIC, and he keeps trying to educate me on it. So I'm working on it.
Okay. Thank you. I'll just, what I'm going to do is stop the recording there, and we'll stay on for a couple more questions if that is okay, if you've got a couple minutes. But yes, just wanted to say thank you so much to Jaqui for taking us through that, and also for all our participants for joining at probably very odd times in days across the globe. So thank you very much. Your support is very much appreciated. And look out for the replay email, and scan to the bottom of the replay email, because there will be more information about events there as well. Okay.
Yeah. And thank you for having me. It was fun.
Great.